Awesome. So folks, first of all, thank you so much for joining. If you don't know, this is Outside the Round with the National Parliamentary Debate League. The goal of this speaker series is for us to gather as a community, not with the focus on debate and argumentation, but to get together and have discussion and deepen our own understanding. And so I'll introduce our two hosts. I'm Miss Uka. I'm one of the outreach directors for the NPDL. And I'm really excited to introduce my co-director, Makendra McCoy, who will be one of our hosts for this evening. And then hi, Makendra. And then our league president, Breyer, will also be a host for this evening. And so I'll turn it over to you all.
Yeah, thanks so much, Akuna, for putting things together here and for hosting things. I want to give a massive thanks for everybody attending to be a part of this event. And thanks so much for Dr. Belkin for joining us tonight to discuss some of the awesome work he's done in his past and continues to do in the future. He also, as some of you have heard mentioned, was a national champion in parliamentary debate. So you are going to see somebody who is taking what we do in theory in the round and taking it, as our speaker series aims for, outside the round to make actual real world change and make this world a better place. As a former debater, I remember debating the work he was doing when I was some of your ages and I was competing, and he was very instrumental in the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which was something that was really a powerful movement, powerful moment in the LGBTQ movement. So without any further ado, I'd love to give Dr. Belkin the floor here. Thanks so much for all your work, and we look forward to hearing a little bit about what you do and hearing a little bit more from you and sharing a Q&A. Once again, if anybody has any questions, please feel free to type them in chat. Dr. Belkin's very happy to answer, and we'll help you guys get those across. Thanks again.
Thank you so much, Breyer and Akuna and Makendra. It's really an honor to be here. As Breyer mentioned, I was a debater in college, and it was one of the most important things in my life for a long time. So I really look forward to learning from you during Q&A and hearing what's on your mind and learning more about what you're thinking. So I'm a professor of political science, and what professors are supposed to do is really two things. One is to teach, of course, and the other is to do research. And the idea behind research is to produce knowledge that other scholars and sometimes the public can benefit from. There's a separate thing that some professors do, however, which is try to get involved in policy making and in making better policy in the world and pursuing social justice by doing whatever they can to get governments to change policy. And I, right after college, worked for a think tank, a research institute at my university that was dedicated to taking research and making sure that the research wasn't just sitting on library shelves and wasn't just for other scholars, but was actually making a difference in the world. And so when I became a junior professor, I was really inspired by the example that my bosses had set when I had my internship at this research institute after college, and I wanted to do the same thing. And so 21 years ago, I set up an institute to work on the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Now, I'm going to get back to that in a second, but because that's what I'm going to talk about for a while. But I just want to take a little detour to say that over the last 21 years, I've pursued 3 social justice campaigns, and they've all worked well. One was to get gays and lesbians and bisexual people into the military. The second was to get transgender people in the military. And the third is not LGBTQ, but is to urge Democrats to expand the Supreme Court if and when they return to power. And I'm going to spend, I'm just going to give short remarks and then we'll open it up to Q&A, but I'm going to spend the time in my remarks talking about LGBTQ military policy. But if you want to hear about the Supreme Court, I'm glad to talk about that during Q&A. And that the Supreme Court work is really interesting to me, anyways. So On Don't Ask, Don't Tell. So Don't Ask, Don't Tell was a law that was passed in 1993 and then implemented in 1994. And the law said basically that gays and lesbians and bisexuals could not serve openly in the US military. And so if you uttered the words, I am gay, as a service member, then the military was required to fire you, which they called discharge you. And the debate over this policy took place in the very first year of the Clinton presidency. Bill Clinton came into office in January 1993, and this was one of the first issues he dealt with. And this was right when I was in graduate school and coming out of the closet. And the debate was just deeply offensive. And people who opposed letting gays and lesbians to serve in the military said just terrible, terrible things, grossly sexualized things. They lied about gays and lesbians, and they won. They prevailed, and they convinced Congress to pass a law banning gays and lesbians from the military. Now, gays and lesbians and bisexual people were already banned from the military, but Bill Clinton was trying to change that, and Congress said, nope, not only are we not going to let you allow gays, lesbians, and bisexuals to serve in the military, but we're going to actually pass a law declaring that to be the case. And so I was just deeply offended by all of that. And my PhD was in political science, but it was in the branch of political science that deals with military studies. And so when I fast forward a few years after grad school, when I was first hired as a junior professor in 1998, I decided I wanted to try to do something to change Don't Ask, Don't Tell, to get the U.S. military to allow gays and lesbians and bisexuals to serve openly. So if you think about that for a minute and imagine yourself in that position, and you're like this professor in a library, and the US military, I can't remember its budget at the time, it was probably about $300 billion a year, but you know, the military had the money and the power and uh, all the resources that militaries have. And I was just kind of sitting there in the library. And so, I could write opinion pieces in the newspaper till the cows came home, but that wasn't going to do anything to change the policy. So I had to figure out a social justice policy that would hopefully actually move policy. And I came up with an idea. And the idea, I'll explain the strategy behind the idea, but the strategy was premised on the notion that the policy was held up in place by lies. And so I want to just stop and meditate on that for a moment. So when governments put in place policies, they have to have reasons for them. At least uh, they have to pretend to have reasons for them. They have to say that they have reasons for them, and there are reasons for that we can talk about. But just taking that as a kind of axiomatic premise. And so when the debate over Don't Ask, Don't Tell was happening, it's true that people outside of Congress were saying just terrible things about gays and lesbians, and it's true that that was a homophobic time in American culture, still is, but it was even worse. But it was not permissible at that point for the opponents of President Clinton, the opponents of gays and lesbians in the military, to come into Congress and say, you, Congress, must oppose the president. You must keep gays and lesbians out of the military. And the reason for that is because we hate gays and lesbians. They're disgusting. They do this, they do that. They're awful. They're horrible. So it would have been seen as inappropriate, even though it was a homophobic moment in American culture, for the opponents of gays and lesbians in the military to tell the truth about why they didn't want gays and lesbians in the military. And the truth, you can call it hatred, you can call it homophobia, you can call it animus, you can call it intolerance, you can morality, whatever you want to call it. But that was the truth of why they didn't want gays and lesbians in the military. So they couldn't tell the truth. And so what they did instead was they made up a fake argument that they called the unit cohesion rationale. And what they would do is so witnesses who testified in Congress over and over and over during these hearings, they would say, oh, we love gays and lesbians. We have friends who are gays and lesbians, but militaries require trust in order to function. And if you're in a foxhole and it's a battle, you have to trust the person next to you has got your back. And even though we experts testifying on the policy are okay with gays and lesbians, the soldiers in the foxholes are not. And if you have someone in a unit that utters the words, I am gay, or I'm lesbian, or I'm bisexual, then no one in the unit is going to trust them. And when a unit doesn't trust each other, that the way the military says that is it lacks cohesion. And cohesion or trust is necessary for military effectiveness or military readiness. And so what they call this the unit cohesion rationale. So the law that they passed literally says that the reason gays and lesbians and bisexuals can't serve in the military is because if gays and lesbians were allowed to serve in the military and say that they're gay or lesbian or bisexual, then unit cohesion would fall apart. The bonds of trust in units would be shattered, and the military would no longer be able to pursue its mission. Now, so you can think of kind of two pillars holding up the don't ask, don't tell policy. There was the truth, which was homophobia, which the defenders of discrimination could not acknowledge. And then there was the phony rationale they created that you could also say they lied about, which is that gays and lesbians undermine cohesion. Now, the military itself knew at the time that gays and lesbians don't undermine cohesion. There had actually been military research on this going back decades, and scholars certainly knew this. But there's a big difference between scholars knowing something and the public at large understanding it. And so the social justice strategy that we put in place at the institute I started called the Palm Center, it was based on an advertising strategy. And the advertising strategy is that, if you saw one commercial in your life for Honda, then when it's time for you to buy a car, it's pretty unlikely you'd buy a Honda. But if you see commercial after commercial after commercial after commercial your whole life, that once it's time to buy a car, you may actually buy a Honda. Not a 100% chance, but that steady drip of repetition is important for public persuasion. And so we put in place a strategy that was designed to use research to flip that unit cohesion rationale on its head. In other words, to use research to make the argument that it's not gays and lesbians that undermine unit cohesion, it's discrimination that undermines unit cohesion. And the idea was that we would do a new study 3 or 4 times a year, always asking the exact same question, do gays and lesbians and bisexual people undermine unit cohesion, but asking it in a slightly different way. So we might say, in Britain, which at the time allowed gays and lesbians to serve, did the British military suffer a decrease in cohesion when they allowed gays and lesbians to serve? What about police departments? The San Diego Police Department allowed gays and lesbians and bisexuals to serve openly. Did they suffer a decrease in unit cohesion? What about the CIA? So to ask the question in a slightly different way, but rather than letting the research sit on a shelf. The point was with each research study was to get journalists to cover the study because we wanted to repeat our message that gays and lesbians and bisexuals don't undermine cohesion. Discrimination undermines cohesion. We wanted that message not to be repeated in the library and not to be repeated in obscure journals, but to be repeated on television and in newspapers that people read. And the reason that was a difficult strategy to pursue is that hundreds of studies, maybe even thousands, are published every day, and they're not newsworthy. So most studies get zero attention in the media. Whereas it was essential for our studies, if our social justice strategy was going to work, to get media coverage of our studies. And so the question was always, how can we ask our question and do our research in such a way as to entice reporters to want to cover the same message? I'll say a little more about that in a second, but I want to clarify there were different strategies that were important for repealing Don't Ask, Don't Tell. There were lawyers, and sorry, I'm in an apartment where there's a kind of noise all around me that I can't control, so you might hear a dog or a scream. Apologies. So there were litigators who were suing the military throughout much of this time in court to try to show that Don't Ask, Don't Tell was unconstitutional. There were lobbyists who were walking the halls of Congress quietly educating legislators. There were grassroots activists who were chaining themselves to the White House fence. So there were different kinds of advocates pursuing different strategies. But our argument at the Palm Center was, as long as the generals and admirals with a straight face can make the argument that lifting the ban, lifting Don't Ask, Don't Tell would undermine unit cohesion, as long as they can make that case with a straight face in a highly militarized society where people trust generals and admirals, then the other strategists, the litigators, the grassroots activists, the lobbyists, they're never going to be able to prevail. They're never going to be able to win and change the policy because the need to have an effective military will trump all other needs. And so, for example, to give you an example of what that looks like, during this long struggle, and I worked on this for about 10 years, a soldier named Barry Winchell was beaten to death with a baseball bat at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, and it made national news. He was gay, and he was beaten to death for being gay. And the former commandant of the Marine Corps, the general who had been in charge of the entire U.S. Marine Corps, published an op-ed in the New York Times, which said, "So sorry that this guy was beaten to death. Bummer. But we can't allow gays and lesbians to serve in the military because that would undermine unit cohesion. Yeah, it's a little unfair, but military effectiveness is more important than fairness." So our strategy was designed to suck the oxygen out of that argument, to make it impossible to prevail with that argument in the court of public opinion. And I'll fast forward. I'm jumping back and forth in time, but I want to just say at this point, at the end of the Don't Ask, Don't Tell struggle in 2010, when President Obama was trying to get the policy repealed, which he succeeded in doing, there were some opponents who tried to use the unit cohesion argument and say, no, President Obama, you can't allow gays and lesbians to serve openly. That would undermine cohesion. But because our strategy had worked, they weren't taken seriously. They were laughed out of the room. And so judges and journalists and members of Congress and White House staff all knew that what they were doing was not going to imperil military readiness if they pushed for the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. So what did the strategy look like? So we did this about 35 times over 10 years. So 3 or 4 times a year for 10 years. Literally worked every single time. So we never tried to launch a media campaign and then failed to get media. And I'm really proud of that because some of them were pretty hard. But I'll just give you an example of the types of thing we did 3 or 4 times a year for 10 years. So we did a 70-page study asking if the lifting of the gay ban in Britain had been a success. We talked to every expert in Britain on the policy, every opponent of gays and lesbians in the military in Britain, reviewed all the literature on this, and we found no evidence that the repeal of the British ban had caused a decrease in unit cohesion in the British military. We took that to the New York Times reporter in London. They have a London reporter. She said, not interested. It turns out what she needed to see was a human interest angle. So it wasn't interesting to her to have a study. It was interesting to her if we could illustrate the study with a personal story. She would have found that much more compelling. And so we went back and we found a gay member of a British submarine crew who'd been fired from the military when Britain had a ban and then allowed back onto the submarine when Britain lifted its ban. And we went back to the New York Times reporter in London and said, hey, we have a new study and we have this guy who will talk to you. And she said, and she wrote a front page story, New York Times, gays and lesbians in the British military, a success. So that's an example kind of like your Honda Motor Corporation commercial. So we tried to engineer a commercial like that 3 or 4 times a year. I can give 1 or 2 other examples, and I just want to check on time just to be mindful so I don't spend the whole hour talking at you and leave time for you to talk. We did another study where it turned out, so the government at one point reported the financial cost of of firing gays and lesbians, which we would argue was money wasted. But we had mathematicians who estimated that the actual cost of firing gays and lesbians was double what they had reported, so 100% more than they'd reported. Their estimate was off by 100%. And so we did a study and we convinced a former Secretary of Defense to sign the study. Think about the difference if you're a reporter. New study from some homosexual activist in California. The military's estimate of the cost of firing gays and lesbians is less than the actual cost. Not so credible. What about this one? New study signed by a former Secretary of Defense who was in charge of the 2+ million person military, issues a new study saying that the cost of firing gays and lesbians is more than the government reported. That's credible. Because it was a good study, but also signed by a former Secretary of Defense, the study made national news. And think about what's the message here. It wasn't literally about unit cohesion, but it was that there's a cost to military discrimination. So it's discrimination that harms the military, this time financially. It's not gays and lesbians who harm the military. So it was another variation of our message. So each time we did a little mini campaign, we'd have to come up with a slightly different way to ask the same question about the data to give reporters an opportunity to report on our message. Okay. I'm not going to say anything more about Don't Ask, Don't Tell, but I will talk about the transgender, and glad to talk about, as much as you want in Q&A, but I'm not going to say anything else more about it now. But wait, is that true or is there something else I want to say? Oh, and that's my sister calling. Excuse me. Um, so I will talk for a minute about transgender troops in the military. So fast forward to 2011, the military, the Congress and the military repealed Don't Ask, Don't Tell, allowed gays and lesbians to serve openly. Repeal was a success. But the military still had a transgender ban because Don't Ask, Don't Tell was silent on gender identity, and transgender people were banned under separate regulations. And I was in the process of turning out the lights on the Palm Center. We'd done our campaign. It had been a little more than a decade. It was enough. But one of our donors, who is a retired colonel and is also transgender herself, called me and said, I'd like you to do for transgender troops what you did for gays and lesbians in the military. I'd be willing to finance that. And so I was like, we can do that, but it's going to take 15 years, which, no, there was no way in advance to predict how long the campaign would take. But that was just my way of saying, don't expect results anytime soon. The donor did provide the funds. The campaign worked much, much faster than I thought. And in just 3 years under President Obama, the policy crumbled, and we got inclusive policy for transgender troops, actually for transsexuals, not for non-binary troops. And we can talk about that difference in Q&A if you want to hear about that, because it's fascinating to talk about that in the military context. But what I'll say about the trans military campaign is we used exactly the same strategy for trans inclusion that we'd used for LGBT inclusion. The one difference being that it was a different lie that was holding in place the transgender ban. So we had to dismantle a different lie. The military's lie that it was using to ban transgender troops was not that transgender troops undermine unit cohesion. It was that transgender troops require complicated medical care. And we, the military, couldn't possibly figure out how to provide medical care to transgender personnel. If you think about it, it is true that the military needs its service members to be healthy, and there are some medical conditions. If a service member has metastatic cancer, they're probably not going to be able to stay in the military for that long. So there is kind of some, potential resonance of the argument. But all that being said, trans people need literally exactly the same medical care that non-transgender or cisgender people need. And so in order to open up a space to repeal the transgender ban, we had to show in the court of public opinion that the military could easily provide medical care for trans troops. Um, so I want to say a moment about kind of messengers or spokespersons or validators. So I said a few minutes ago, I asked you to imagine the difference between a study by, homosexual activists in San Francisco or California versus a study by a general or an admiral or a secretary of defense. The reason in that case that the secretary of defense is a more credible messenger for that message is that you would expect gays and lesbians to speak up on behalf of gay and lesbian service members. You would not expect generals or admirals or a secretary of defense to speak up on behalf of gays and lesbians because at the time the military was banning gays and lesbians. And so if you were, conducting a campaign to try to ban sugar from school lunches, just for example, who would a surprising validator be? Well, okay, if you had a nutritionist try to make that case, great, that's not bad. But what if you could get a sugar company executive to make the case that sugar should be banned from school lunches? That would be even more credible. So you want to find surprising validators to make your case. So in the case of transgender military service, we wanted to disable this medical lie. And so we started out by approaching a former US Surgeon General. So the Surgeon General is the top doctor in the United States. And we approached former Surgeon General Jocelyn Elders, and we asked her, would you do a study with us on whether the military could provide transition-related care to trans troops? And she said yes. And we did the study. And our studies are always very careful. And if we find evidence that's inconsistent with our political beliefs, we report that. So the point is not to cook the books. The point is to use a preponderance of evidence standard to amass data to make your case and then get that data in the media. So Surgeon General Elders' study went methodically through each piece of the medical rationale for banning trans troops. What about surgery? What about mental health care? What about hormones? And she found that in each case, that cisgender troops need exactly the same hormones that trans troops need. They need exactly the same surgeries that transgender people need. Some of them need exactly the same psychological care that some transgender troops need. And so there's no difference, in other words. The conclusion of her study was that trans troops are as medically fit as their non-transgender peers. And so we were able to convince the New York Times to write an editorial about that study, because remember, the point is not to do the research for the library shelf, but to get the research in the media. Because the media is the source of power, and we can, discuss why that's the case if you'd like to. But that study worked so fast that the ban crumbled like a house of cards. We still had 2 more years of pushing at that point, but we were pushing. I wouldn't say against an open door, but I would say that, what's the metaphor? That we had the wind at our backs. And 2 days after the editorial was angry, and the Secretary of Defense at the time was named Chuck Hagel, and the editorial from the New York Times said, Secretary Hagel, read this study and change this policy. And 2 days after this editorial was published, Secretary Hagel announced that for the first time in American history, he would review the transgender ban. So that was kind of the crack in Humpty Dumpty. And then we just had to keep pounding on the egg to crack the egg. But unlike Don't Ask, Don't Tell, that took, I was only involved in the struggle for 12 years, I guess, total. But it was 17 years of public education that went on. But on trans military, it only took a couple of years of public education before we were able to change the policy, and we can talk about why that's the case in Q&A. I've gone on for 20 minutes. Lots more to say, but why don't we open up to Q&A? We can talk about LGBT in the military, we can talk trans in the military, we can talk about Supreme Court. We can talk about whatever you want to talk about. So yeah, I'll stop now.
Awesome. Thanks so much. So I'm getting some messages from several other coaches that it's really kind of inspiring and fascinating to hear on what went into this. I'm going to open it up for Q&A. I already have one person who has their hand up. If you have any questions you'd like to ask publicly, feel free to put them in the chat. If you'd like to ask them anonymously, feel free to message those directly to myself or McCoy. Anna, you had the first hand up, and then Alex will follow up with you shortly afterwards. Anna, go ahead.
So my first question, and I'll just ask them one at a time, so I'll let other people speak. But it's that when you were able to get Don't Ask, Don't Tell repealed successfully, what positive spillover effects do you think that had on other areas of LGBTQ plus rights, as in like not in the military?
So I'm an anti-militarist because I believe that militarism does a lot of damage at home and abroad. It's different than opposing the military as an organization, but I oppose a culture of militarism. Uncritical worship of the military, I think, is unhealthy. We're a very militarized society, however, and my Don't Ask, Don't Tell repeal work was very militarized because we were leveraging the argument that gays and lesbians should be allowed into the military because they would strengthen the military. So because we are such a militarized society, or as part of being such a militarized society, there is a great deal of not just respect, but worship for the armed forces in our society. And so when people saw gays and lesbians serving in uniform and not just tolerated, but welcomed by the armed forces, I would argue this did have an important effect on ripple effects on civilian society, which is as we predicted, because going back 2,000 years, if you look at the markers of first-class citizenship in different societies, it's almost always depended on the right to enter into contracts, the right to own property, and the right to serve in the military. That's what first-class citizenship is. And so just to give one concrete example of what that ripple effect looks like, the scholars on my staff published a paper where they argued that the Supreme Court would not have been able to allow for marriage equality or gay marriage if the military ban were still in place, or if they had done so, they would have had to do so in a much more circumscribed way because I mean, first of all, there's just kind of the cultural symbolism of having gay soldiers, which in and of itself probably had a powerful impact on judges and justices and reporters. But just in kind of the narrow lane of jurisprudence and the law, if Don't Ask, Don't Tell had still been in place, the government would still have had an explicit interest in marriage discrimination because you couldn't allow two gay service members to be married and serve in the military. So the government would not have wanted to allow gay marriage in the military, and that would have been a constraining effect or a limiting effect on Justice Kennedy's ruling. So that's just kind of one example of the ripple effect. I would argue that the Boy Scouts never would have been able to move in a positive direction on gay scouts if it hadn't been for the military. And symbolically, this is why opponents of gays and lesbians in the military. Briar, are we allowed to swear on this?
I have no problem with that.
Opponents of gays and lesbians in the military didn't give a shit about gay troops. The reason they opposed gays and lesbians in the military, and they certainly didn't give a shit about unit cohesion, because even when we showed that gays and lesbians enhance cohesion, they didn't care. The reason they fought so hard is because they knew, Anna, exactly what you're getting at. You put your finger on the most important point. They knew that once gays and lesbians were allowed to serve in the military, that would lock in citizenship rights in other realms, and that's what they didn't want. So that's really what the fight was about.
We appreciate passion in our speakers, so thank you. And a lot of times I agree, we hide behind a shield, a veneer for something else to try and protect us from our real intentions. So yeah, thank you for that work. There are a lot of people in this chat right now that are benefiting from those changes in our society. Alex, I think you're next one up. You got a question?
Yeah, I was interested when you mentioned that right now the media seems to be a big source of power in American politics. And I was wondering if you could talk a bit about how that happened, whether you think that is a good or bad thing, and if it's a bad thing, whether it can be, or how and should it be remedied.
Yeah, so I think I might have been a little bit unclear in my remarks because I didn't mean to imply that, that's a great question, didn't mean to imply that right now the media is powerful in a way that wasn't the case 10 or 20 or 30 years ago. And I also did not mean to imply that the media has agency. So when I talk about the media being powerful, what I mean is that it's a power resource that other players in the political process can leverage. And so what I mean by that is that if you think about, you think about cable news, and that they're just like, news all day, every day, like blah 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 blah. But there's still there are only so many news stories that can be reported every day on CNN and CBS and the New York Times and Associated Press. And every single day, thousands and thousands and thousands of corporations and politicians and NGOs, nonprofits, are competing with each other to get their message into the media. Because they know that if they get their message into the media, all kinds of good things will happen for them. First of all, um, uh, they will have a chance at persuading the public to believe what they want them to believe. They will have a chance of influencing decision makers. Getting in the media can be a source of fundraising, because when your donors see that you're in the New York Times, they think, oh, this is a really effective person or organization. And so every day there's a competition among those thousands and thousands and thousands of folks trying to get media coverage. And only a small handful of those people win, which means only a small handful of those people actually get the media coverage that they're trying to get. Um, and and most of them don't get the media coverage they want. So that's why nonprofits and politicians and corporations spend millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars on strategies and consultants to try to get into the news. And that was our biggest challenge at the Palm Center. It wasn't doing the research, it was getting the media to cover the research. So now I think you have one implication of your question is to wonder, like, in an era where the President of the United States refers to the media as fake news, is the media still a power resource for those who are able to leverage it? And I would say yes. Um, there's a lot more to say about that, but let me stop, and before someone else asks the question, just go back to you and ask you, did that answer or quasi answer the question, or would you like to kind of rephrase the question?
Yeah, that answered it. I think in part I was misinterpreting when you said media being a source of power, what you necessarily meant.
And editorial boards and owners of publishers do have power. But that's just not the power that I was talking about.
Right. Yeah, that's what I had in mind, like media being owned by a handful of companies and that having a big sway and things like that.
Well, that's absolutely the case. I mean, just to give an example, like the military industrial complex, weapons manufacturers traditionally have owned a lot of newspapers, and it shouldn't be a surprise that those newspapers are often not critical of military spending. So absolutely, yes. And by the way, sorry, one way in which the media absolutely has power, although there are different kinds of power, and the power I'm going to talk about now, it's not kind of smoky back room, let's have a conspiracy power. It's just kind of the way the system operates, I would argue. But on my Supreme Court, so on gays and lesbians in the military, when I started that work, the topic was already a thing. So there were already reporters who would talk about gays and lesbians in the military. So it was hard to get into the newspaper, but it was not hard to convince them to hear my pitch and to consider, putting our stuff in the newspaper. On the Supreme Court, when I started, no one had talked about Supreme Court expansion for 81 years. And so there were literally no reporters in the country who considered that a legitimate topic. So the media does, and so it was super hard to break in at first to get me, and still actually to get media coverage of our proposal and ideas. So the media kind of has a power to kind of set the boundaries on what counts as legitimate debate. And for example, like the media is not going to do articles on people who believe the Earth is flat, but there are lots of gray areas where people who would like power and probably deserve power don't get it in part because they can't convince the media to take them seriously. There's also a huge race and gender dimension on that too.
This is so interesting and multi-layered. I got tons of people messaging me, oh my God, we need to have a whole second chat. And I can tell you that personally, when it comes to the Supreme Court, your work has affected us. Our debate teams have it's spilled over. We're talking about changing the makeup of the court, so that's definitely working.
Well,
Um,
that's good because if it doesn't happen, our democracy's over. So,
yeah, I think who was it? It might have actually been Donald Rumsfeld himself said that I can think of no greater power than having control over the topic of high school debates. I was kind of shocked to hear that. I have to check if it was him or Dick Cheney, but it was one of those former Bush appointees, so it does have an impact. I'm going to go to Xander, then Gabriel, then I got a question writing from Artem. Please keep the questions coming. They're really helpful. We appreciate them and want to know what you want to know. Xander, go ahead, and then Gabriel.
Hi, so mine was basically on your advertising strategy. Do you think that it's better if you have only fewer ads throughout the year so that it sticks in the person's head, or having more so then it influences their decision? Like you brought up the example of Honda. Do you think that in that case it would be better to have like just four studies or just more?
so there are scientists who study this stuff, especially for campaigns, because campaigns and corporations and nonprofits always have finite resources, and they want to make sure they're optimizing the number of quote unquote touches, or the number of times they try to persuade viewers. You can also say try to manipulate viewers or potential voters or consumers. And corporations spend a lot about, corporations don't want to waste money on advertising. So there's always the question of what's the right amount of advertising. In my world, we just simply didn't have the bandwidth to make our case more than 3 or 4 times a year. But I mean, each time we were think about this for a second. Each time we were successful getting a reporter to cover our research or our message, the message by definition became more stale and less interesting. So it wasn't interesting to reporters to have like another study showing gays don't undermine the military, once we've gotten media coverage of 20 similar studies over the past 5 years. So the bar kept moving higher and higher and higher and higher on what would count as a news story. And the very last story we broke took 2 years and $100,000 of staff time to build, but it was important. And we got 100, it wasn't a study, but we got 104 generals and admirals to sign a statement saying that gays and lesbians and bisexual people don't hurt the military, but Don't Ask, Don't Tell was hurting the military. Now there's a whole separate interesting story of how we got media coverage for that, because even that the reporters didn't want to cover. But no, we would have loved. So we're a small think tank. Like I mean, now we're up to on transmilitary probably spending about 800,000 a year. But back in the day, we were spending $500,000 a year, which think think tank. Think tanks usually spend a lot more than that. I mean, there are a lot of 20 and 30 and 40 and $50 million think tanks. So we were just a tiny little dumpy operation, and the best we could do would be to engineer 3 or 4 research-based media campaigns per year.
You just answered one of the questions I had burning in my head, is what is the cost? And I'll just chime in here really quickly. It's fascinating to me how much it costs, but at the same time, how little. Like $1 million a year to change our society is shocking how little it takes.
Yeah, I mean the Supreme Court. Well, get this, well, two things. And if I have a very bad short-term memory, so remind me to talk about the 104 generals and admirals. But first, the Supreme Court. I mean, we've spent $1.5 million in 2 years on the Supreme Court, but the Washington Post published we got some quasi-moderate rulings that were unexpected in the last couple months from the Supreme Court. They issued a decision on gun safety that wasn't as bad as it could have been, on reproductive justice that wasn't as bad as it could have been, on LGBTQ rights, and on DACA. And the Washington Post columnist argued that the reason the court was moderate is because of the threat that we engineered to expand the court. In other words, they're trying to lay low a little bit so as not to piss off the Democrats even more, because they don't want the Democrats to come in and expand them. Think about that, $1.5 million to get the court to issue 4 moderate rulings. Like, that is the bargain of a century, because each of these, I mean, just the DACA campaign, millions of dollars spent on both sides of that campaign. So tens of millions of dollars. So you're right. It's expensive, but in the scheme of things, it's not. I mean, Don't Ask, Don't Tell repeal, depending on how you do the math, cost about $30 million of what all the different nonprofits spent. Gay marriage equality cost hundreds of millions of dollars. Transgender military repeal probably cost about $3 or $4 million. But other social justice campaigns, you could spend $100 million and not succeed. Now, just one adjacent, I hate filibustering. I'm sorry for filibustering, but just I know there are people with questions.
We're enjoying what you're hearing. Keep going.
One more thing about cost. Why did the 104 generals and admirals story cost 2 years of staff time and $100,000? Because it's really hard to get generals and admirals to say positive things about gays and lesbians. And at any given time, there are about 8,000 living. So currently serving generals and admirals were not going to say anything for us because they can't, because they're constrained. They work for the Pentagon. So our only targets of opportunity were retired generals and admirals. So there are 8,000 of them at any one time. And, every month, a few more retire and a few more die. So on average, there are about 8,000 retired generals and admirals. And so it's hard to get contact information for them, but we were able to get contact information for about 4,000 of them. And we individually called and mailed each one of them and ended up having conversations with so 3,500 of them wouldn't talk to us, but 500 would. And we had about 500 conversations, and of those, 104 were willing to sign the statement. So that's what cost $100,000 was that staff time.
That's shocking and interesting, but amazing that those 500 people, right? It seems like over and over again, what you're saying is putting the pressure in the right area seems to be key. Finding the spot where you can apply.
Well, I mean, so I would argue that, the one thing we had on our side in the Don't Ask, Don't Tell repeals, or the strongest resource we had was truth. It was that the other side was lying about the rationale for policy. And if we could expose their lie as a lie, we could force them into silence, because they weren't going to be able to say, we oppose gays and lesbians in the military because we're homophobic. So if they can't, and the unit cohesion rationale, the rationale had changed over time. In the 50s, gays and lesbians were banished from the military because they were thought to be security risks. In the 60s, because they were thought to be alcoholics, So the rationale can shift, but the debate in 93, 94 was so prominent that the opposition locked itself, they kind of married themselves to the unit cohesion rationale. So if we could expose that as a lie, then they could either say nothing or they could be exposed as liars or homophobes. And so it was still hard to push repeal across the line, but it was possible for the litigators and lobbyists and grassroots activists to push repeal across the line because the opposition could not make a credible argument in court or in Congress or in the Pentagon or in the White House.
I have so many questions I want to ask, but I need to let everybody else get in here too. There's a lot that people want to ask. Let me go next to Gabriel.
Yeah, so you've been talking a lot about the way you were strategizing about going about this, and you were talking about specifically how it's really necessary to not just teach intellectuals about it, because these are like lies that most people know about, and it's more important to be actually reaching out to the public. And you talked about how that was particularly important because of like how militarized our country is. Do you think that that type of concept is more applicable on any level, or just more specifically with militarization because how militarized our country is?
It's a really brilliant question. I don't think I can give a universal answer to that. There are certainly social justice campaigns that make progress without changing public opinion. I mean, on trans rights outside the military, there is a group called National Center for Transgender Equality. They were able to make tremendous progress under Obama, changing a whole host of federal regulations even before public opinion on transgender people changed. So you don't have to change public opinion in order to pursue social justice, but it really, really helps. And the reason there are many reasons it helps, but ultimately what's going on is, I mean, when people vote in the ballot box, they have thousands of things in their mind, or not, but it's very rare for the people go and vote on a single issue. But it is embarrassing for politicians to support policies that the public doesn't like, because during campaigns, if they support unpopular policies, their opponents and or journalists can say, hey, why do you support gays and lesbians in the military when the research shows that gays and lesbians are good for the military and the public thinks gays and lesbians should serve? That's embarrassing for a politician. A politician doesn't want to be in that position. So changing public opinion is a resource for moving politicians into the right place. Now, it is not sufficient. There are, vast majority of the public wants gun safety regulations, but the NRA has so much money that they've managed to block it. There are a lot of policies that the public would like that we don't get. So changing public opinion is not sufficient for getting policy change, and it is not necessary. I would argue it is facilitative.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. Artem's question is up next. Let me scroll up in the chat. Sorry, 1 second. SCOTUS question. Some people are burning with those Supreme Court questions. Expanding SCOTUS is a tactic that both Democrats and Republicans can hypothetically use. If you think Democrats should be the one to use it, what is the better tactic? Starting to publicly advocate for it right now, or waiting until Democrats actually win an election? And just to tag on to that, when I was preparing for this, that was one of the questions I had as well, is because it seems like you're very progressive. Advocating for it under Trump, right, could be a risky, hypothetically a risky maneuver. So what's your thoughts there?
Well, they can't get away with it now because to expand the court, you have to have the White House, the House, and the Senate, because you have to pass a law, and they don't have the House. So they're not going to get away with it now. That's not the way American politics work. You cannot create a conversation out of thin air and expect policy change to happen the moment you make the case, even if you have a good argument. You have to build up public support for your point and build up support among politicians and thought leaders in order to have a chance of prevailing when you have power. Now, I realize there's a separate question of retaliation, but if we had waited to engineer this conversation until January 2021, the Democrats would come back into office and we'd say, expand the court. And but they're going to be pressured in January 2021 by many, many different activist communities to do all kinds of different stuff, and we would have zero chance of prevailing if we were silent until they won. Parallel truth on that is, there still are a lot of centrists, fewer and fewer, but especially when we started, a lot of centrists who really wanted us to shut the fuck up. And their argument, I had a conversation with Joe Trippi, who had been a progressive. He was Howard Dean's campaign manager, but his job now is getting Democrats running for Senate in purple states like Colorado and North Carolina and Arizona to getting those senators to win. Great. I'm a Democrat. I'm a progressive. I want those senators to win. He's afraid that if the Democrats started talking about court expansion, that would alienate purple state voters in Senate races. So he didn't want, he's like, shut the hell up and do not engage in this campaign. Wait until 2021. Well, what would have happened if we'd wait until 2021? We would have started our campaign and the Joe Trippis of the world would be, you got to be quiet because in 2023, we're going to be running in the midterms in purple districts and purple states, and we don't want moderate Democrats to have to answer questions about court expansion in the 2023 midterms. There is always going to be an incentive to stay silent. And one of my mentors, just a brilliant, brilliant tactician named Dave Fleischer, who's still around 30 years after he started mentoring me, he said, it almost never makes sense in politics to be quiet. In other words, if you have something to say, you got to say it. Now, there is a separate piece of your question that deals with Republican retaliation. So what about the possibility of Republican retaliation? I have many, many things to say about that. I will not filibuster unless you have more questions about this, but I'll speak briefly to it. First of all, the Republicans already stole the court in 2016. It's unprecedented in modern American history for a party not to let a president fill a vacancy. And by the way, they stole the court by changing the number of justices to 8. And by the way, they said that if Hillary Clinton had won the election, they were going to hold the number of justices at 8 until they got a Republican president. So the Republicans already stole the court. Now, use an analogy with your wallet. If your wallet is stolen, you're not going to forego efforts to recover your wallet just because it might get stolen again. I mean, that's nonsensical. And so if there's an important rationale to rebalance the court, rebalance the court. That's point one. Point two is, I would argue, and we haven't even gotten into the rebalance, into the rationale for why the court should be expanded. And the rationale is what it's all about saving democracy, but setting aside saving democracy, which we can talk about or not if you have questions about it. The other thing about Republican retaliation, well, two other things. One is the Republicans have exhibited such bad faith, voter suppression, stealing courts, encouraging foreign enemies to intervene in our elections, not complying with subpoenas. The list of Republican cheating it's fucking long. The Republicans will pack the court if and when they ever need to do so in order to control it. The reason they didn't do that in 2017 when Trump came into office is because they were able to control the court just by appointing someone to fill a vacancy. The idea of packing the court is actually from the Federalist Society. The president of the Federalist Society is the kind of nutty right wing uh, uh, group that has helped the Republicans steal the courts over the last generation. And when the president of the Federalist Society thought that the Republicans would need to pack the court in order to control it, he proposed court packing. So even if the Democrats did absolutely nothing whatsoever, if and when the Republicans come, let's say in 30 years, the Democrats get the court back through normal rotation because someone dies and we finally get to fill the seat, the Republicans will pack the court in order to steal it back if and when they have the opportunity to do so. That's the second or third response. The third or fourth response, I forget where I am on my signposting, is that if you're worried about Republican retaliation, the safest thing to do is to expand the court. Because court expansion is not about the court. Court expansion is about unrigging democracy. The court expansion plan has never been just about the court. It's always been a three-part plan to kill the filibuster, to pass a very aggressive democracy restoration bill that bans gerrymandering, bans dark money, bans voter suppression, grants automatic voter registration, grants statehood to DC, does all these things. The Brennan Center says that that would add 40 million voters to the rolls. The reason you need to expand the court is because if you don't, then Justice Roberts is going to put his grubby fingers on that bill, on that law, and he's going to rip it up, just like he ripped up the Voting Rights Act. If you kill the filibuster and pass an aggressive democracy bill that adds 40 million voters to the rolls, that is the insurance against the Republicans packing the court anytime soon. Because in a fair system, in an unrigged system, in a system where everybody gets to vote, in a system without voter suppression, in a system where the people of DC have Senate representation, in that system, I would argue the Republicans are going to have to de-radicalize at least a little bit in order to win elections in a fair system. The only way they can win elections is by cheating. And so if you make it impossible or more difficult to cheat, they're going to they're going to have to de-radicalize. And they're certainly going to have to de-radicalize if they want to be able to control the White House and the Senate and the House anytime soon. So court expansion is actually the safest strategy if you're worried about retaliation. Okay, that was a longer answer than I thought it would be. But.
I like it. I just had somebody comment to me, okay, you can just tell he went into debater mode.
Yeah, and the argument is right.
It's nice when you can do both, right? Use those debate skills to actually do something for good. I have questions on that, but I got a slew of people in here in line, so I want to get to all of them before I ask my questions. Jackson has a question he'd like to ask. Jackson.
Yeah, so I just want to say thank you so much for coming. Your speaking has been absolutely fascinating, and I just want to keep talking about the packing of the courts, specifically on what factors have you seen over history, as someone that knows a lot about this, that has led the courts to become so partisan? Like, what are the important factors that have led to that and led to the situation we're in right now?
I would argue that the radicalization of the courts is a reflection of the radicalization of the Republican Party. I would argue that what we have now is not polarization, but asymmetric polarization, where the Democrats have gotten a little bit more liberal over the last generation, but the Republicans have gotten a lot more conservative. But their radicalization is not just about radical policy positions. By the way, the Republican Party is, I believe, the only party in the world that doesn't believe climate change is happening. I mean, they're more radical than, Syria when it comes to policy. So they are insane on policy. Well, you can see their approach to COVID, like where they're very happy to tolerate 160,000 deaths, disproportionately killing people of color. So they're insane on policy. But their radicalization is not just about extreme policy. It's just describing what radicalization is. It's a commitment to insane radical policy. It's a commitment to cheating. Every party prioritizes its power to some degree, but it's a radical prioritization of their partisan power over national interests. For example, inviting Russia to sabotage our elections. But even worse than all of that is it's a commitment to lying and to not telling the truth. It has nothing to do with Trump. You could see Republicans taking evidence out of policy and putting lies into policy starting 30 years ago. Timothy Snyder, a brilliant professor at Yale, says that once a political party becomes committed to lying, anything's possible, including totalitarianism. why is the Republican Party so radical now? I would argue, and why is it committed to lying? So, a bit of a complicated story, but I'll just isolate one factor. And so I would argue the courts have become radicalized because the Republicans have become radicalized and have stolen and captured the courts. And the Democrats who've been trying to play by the rules and be institutionalists have not been willing to play hardball, as the Republican hardball has gotten so hard and so extreme that it's cheating, like what they did in 2016 to steal the court. Also, obstructionism, by the way, is one of the ways they cheat. They only allowed Barack Obama to seat two appellate court judges in his last 2 years, which is why when Trump came into office, he had 100 openings to fill. Those should have all been Obama judges, lower court judges that Obama should have filled if they hadn't obstructed like that. Why is the Republican Party committed to radicalization and lying? I would argue that the Republican Party should be understood as a fusion or an alliance of two networks. One network is capitalist, which you could say are very, very rich people and corporations, and basically the only thing that those folks want is tax cuts for the rich and deregulation of corporations. The things that those folks want are not, and those corporations want, are not powerful. Like, most voters do not believe in tax cuts for the rich and corporate deregulation. So that side of the party, by definition, has to lie about what it stands for. And so, for example, in the aughts, when George Bush proposed a bill that was basically a handout to coal and power and gas, he called it the Clear Skies Initiative. So it just fucking lied about what the bill was about. That's the capitalist wing, the oil, coal, and gas and coal companies, framing their bill in a dishonest way. So that's that side of the party lying. The other part, the problem that the capitalists have is that they, in order to have power, they need to win elections. And in order to win elections, they need to have voters, and they don't have enough voters who believe in their agenda. And so they've made an unholy alliance with what I'll call resentment voters or paranoid voters. Paranoia is fear without basis. And here what I have in mind is the constellation of people who are white supremacist, and I believe there's xenophobia and white supremacy and homophobia and transphobia and misogyny on the left, but I believe it's out of control on the right. So here you have a constellation of voters who believe in white supremacy, xenophobia, homophobia, transphobia, sexism, patriarchy, things like that. And what the capitalists do through Fox News is they make up phony threats to anger the resentment voters and to get the resentment voters to vote for capitalists who go to Washington and cut taxes. Now, some of that is widely understood, but I would argue that some of it is not. And one of the things that I think is not understood is that this resentment wing, you can think of it as a carousel, they also, ironically under Trump, they're starting to tell the truth more often, but for the most part, they can't tell the truth about what they stand for either. So, for example, the homophobes were not able to say, we oppose gays and lesbians in the military because gays and lesbians are pedophiles who we hate. So instead they lied and they made up the unit cohesion rationale. People who are oppose undocumented immigrants, they can't say we oppose immigration because we think brown people are dirty. So they make up other arguments about why they oppose immigration. You never hear them, complaining about immigration from Canada. I would argue that folks, who are committed to abortion, anti-choice, are probably for the most part much more worried about what would happen if women had control over their bodies than about life. Because if they were worried about life, they would do something about climate change. So the resentment voters can't tell the truth about their paranoia. The capitalists can't tell the truth, and I think the capitalists, by the way, are just as white supremacist as the paranoid wing, but setting that aside, the capitalists can't tell the truth about their economic priorities. The paranoid resentment voters can't tell the truth about the basis of their paranoia. And so you've got a fusion of two groups that by definition cannot tell the truth. And so you've got a party that is absolutely committed to lying. And that's where Trump emerges from. So when Trump says crazy ass shit, no one on the right bats an eye. They actually like it because they are committed to lies. So the reason the courts have become radicalized is because the Republicans have become radicalized and captured the courts.
All right. Now tell us how you really feel. No, this is one of those subjects that, right, when you really look at the implications, it starts to get bigger and bigger. I really appreciate your honesty too and going into depth about this. I got a question here going back to some of the LGBT issues going back in the military. Anya asked in writing, why do you think it was the campaign you did for gay and lesbian people to be able to join the military took so much more time than the one for transgender people? Do you think having done a campaign already helped with the second campaign?
Yeah, I mean, it's a brilliant question, and I might ask it in slightly different ways. It was, why was the trans campaign quicker? If that, actually, I think that is your question. Sorry, good question. It's not that there were all these obstacles in the way of gay and lesbian service that were kind of locked in place during the 1993-1994 debates, because this massive network of Republicans, conservative Democrats, generals and admirals, and churches just locked in their opposition. And so they passed a law. And in our system, it's so there's a difference between law and regulation. Regulations are enacted generally by executive agencies, like the EPA or the military or the Health and Human Services. And presidents have power to change regulations when they come into office. Laws can only be changed by Congress, or the courts, but usually Congress, especially on Don't Ask, Don't Tell, because the courts were not favorable for the first 16 years of the policy. But the problem with changing a law in Congress is that you have the filibuster. And so you have to get 60 senators on your side for almost every change. And so that's a big reason why policy is so sticky in this country. It's very hard to change law as long as the filibuster remains in place, which is part of the reason we have to get rid of the filibuster, because we face national policy emergencies. But so it was very, very hard to build up enough public opinion to the point at which we could get 60 senators, because we had to get, even when the Democrats had 59 senators, we still had to get at least one Republican senator, which was super hard. And so, there was just a lot of opposition. On trans, I thought the trans ban, so the trans ban, by contrast, was not a law, it was a regulation. So in theory, Obama could have just come in and stroke of a pen gotten rid of the regulation. But I still thought that the policy would take a long time to change, because there was no, there was no trans rights, there was no national trans rights conversation in the mainstream media at the time. Now that would change really quickly, and pretty soon there was all of a sudden a conversation, but at the time there wasn't. So I thought we were just going to have to take years and years and years and years to change the public's mind. And this was a radioactive, I mean, it's a boring topic now because 75-80% of the public thinks trans troops should serve, but at the time it was radioactive, and the opponents of gay lesbian equality would often make their case by referring to Don't Ask, Don't Tell as the transgender military policy, like as if allowing gays and lesbians to serve would allow trans people to serve. So we really thought it was going to be super hard to convince the White House and the Pentagon to allow trans people to serve. Part of what happened is that because of the effective unit cohesion strategy on gays and lesbians, the other side, they didn't have a great argument to make, and so anyone who tried to argue that trans people harmed the military, like the benefit of the doubt had shifted, so they were kind of on the defensive from the beginning. A second issue is that for whatever reason, the Christian right, the kind of powerful churches and the cultural warriors like Ralph Reed, made a decision, I'm not sure why, not to say anything about trans military service. And so we didn't really have, we had a few vocal opponents in Congress and the Pentagon who were powerful, and we had to get around them, but we didn't have this massive public network opposing us. A third thing that happened is that during our campaign, the rule on women in combat changed such that any person in the military could do any job. Before that rule change, women were not allowed to serve in combat, even though in effect they often did serve in combat. So totally unfair rule. But once that rule changed, that made it a lot easier for us, because one of the arguments that opponents used for us is like, what are we going to do if you have a guy in the military and he's in combat and then he says that he's a woman? Like, where is he going to serve? Now, they're actually super easy arguments to that, responses to that, but the generals kind of got their minds wrapped up in spaghetti over that one. So once it was possible for every person in the military to do every job, that argument was deprived from the opposition. So yeah, and the activist strategies worked, and they worked really fast.
Awesome. Thanks for
Oh,
that.
sorry. Huge fifth factor. Because of Don't Ask, Don't Tell repeal, we had gays and lesbians throughout the Pentagon in positions of power pushing on behalf of trans people, in a way that was not possible before Don't Ask, Don't Tell was repealed. So we didn't even see the pushing because it was behind closed doors, but we know it happened. We had openly lesbian generals, so we had an openly gay Secretary of the Army. So people could push in a way that they could not push. Not that they were activists, but they could push in quiet conversations with their peers.
It is fascinating how sometimes once those floodgates open for rights, just like when you close them, there can be this cascade effect. Yeah.
Yes, but Trump reversed the policy and put the ban back in place. Now we'll get good policy back if Biden comes back, but unfortunately we weren't able to lock that one in.
We can only do so much. So next up here is from Amaya, which is kind of a follow-up question, but I think you may have answered, but just to ask as well. Which fight was more challenging, the one for gays and lesbians, lesbian rights in the military, or the fight for transgender rights to be in the military? I'm assuming the latter because, as you said, the fight was much shorter.
The toughest one has been the Supreme Court fight, and then the next toughest one was Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And then the trans military one was it wasn't easy, but it was kind of the least treacherous. There were some treacherous moments in the politics between the LGBT groups was actually very, very difficult on both Don't Ask, Don't Tell and trans military. It's funny, like I lost a lot more sleep and had a lot more acid drips in my stomach from coalition politics with the LGBT groups than problems with the Christian right. But no, the smoothest campaign was trans military. Second smoothest, Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Most rocky, Supreme Court. Although the Supreme Court campaign is working, it's just been rocky.
Interesting, very interesting, and even though that's one of the most experienced. I got a question about Don't Ask, Don't Tell as well, coming from Xander. Xander, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah. So my question on Don't Ask, Don't Tell is mainly just, do you think that the everyday person like really knew about this issue and had a vocal about this, or do you think that you brought it more so to the light?
That's a great question. Political science scientists who study public opinion debate, and there are some who argue that in general, the public is made up of opinion followers, and that thought leaders like members of Congress, political leaders, other leaders, say something, and then the public develops its views on the basis of what the thought leaders say. And then there are other people who say that the public is the opinion leaders, and that the politicians, have to say what the public believes. And then there are people who synthesize, the vectors and arrows in different ways. On gays and lesbians in the military, what I would say is that before President Clinton came along and promised during the 92 presidential campaign, he promised to repeal the gay. So gays and lesbians had been banned in the military since, sodomy, sodomy can be cross-sex, but same-sex sodomy had been banned since 1919. But gays and lesbians as an identity, because sex is different than identity, gays and lesbians as an identity, homosexual identity had been banned since World War II. And President Clinton, but in different regulatory forms. And so President Clinton promised to change that in 1992 on the campaign trail. I don't think anyone gay and lesbian troops thought a lot about this because they had to serve in silence. But for the most part, I think the public ignored the issue. Even when Clinton promised to lift the gay ban, I think they ignored the issue. Once he got into office, his opponents decided that gay lesbian military issues was a winner for them because they could humiliate Clinton early in his administration. So it's actually his opponents who forced him to deal with this as the first issue, one of the first issues he dealt with as a new president. He didn't want to deal with this. He would have much rather dealt with healthcare and other stuff right out of the gate. But once the opponents whipped up fanned the flames, then the public got very, very heated about this. And the Don't Ask, Don't Tell debate in 93, 94 was up to that time the greatest fundraising opportunity that the Christian right churches had ever had. So people became very passionate about it once it became a debate in Washington. And then, over time they became less heated.
Thanks so much for that. And we all know that there was that mechanism was amped up right when we had to vote on marriage equity in California. It did not go the way a lot of us were hoping. I have a question here from, let's see, I believe Ryan. I think you're the next up, Ryan.
No, actually, it would be me. Xander,
oh, sorry, Anna, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, so you seem passionate about a lot of issues, like you've spoken about the filibuster as well. Like, how do you decide which areas to advocate for? And on that, what goals do you have for the Palm Center moving forward?
I've been lucky to be part of two campaigns that helped produce social justice, and there are a lot of social justice warriors who are, way more brilliant and way more effective, but they never see social justice enacted in their issues because their opponents are more powerful. Think about like the range of racial justice issues that, still fighting after 400 years. Not to say that racial justice victories never happen, but there are a lot that don't happen, and a lot just across the range. There are just like a lot of social justice victories that never happen, and so if you go into social justice, you have to be prepared to be patient and lose a lot, and accept that you might never get better policy, and also accept that the strategies you pursue will have costs and will do some damage en route to changing policy. So I don't think there's such thing as a clean social justice policy. I have chosen the three campaigns to work on because I thought I could help add value to those three. On the LGBT military ones, I thought I could add value because I was a professor, so I had the legitimacy of the university behind me, so that when we issued a study, it was coming from a university, and that makes it slightly more credible. And also, I had studied the military for my PhD, so I had some knowledge that I thought would help me. But I also had a strategic insight because at the time when I started the Palm Center, the gay lesbian advocates were organizing their arguments around fairness and democracy. And so the opposition would say gays and lesbians will undermine unit cohesion, and our side would say that's not fair, discrimination is unfair. And I thought that was absolutely, I thought discrimination was unfair, but I thought that was absolutely strategically unwise, because a fairness argument would never trump a military effectiveness argument in a militarized society. So I thought I had a strategic insight that if I could build a movement around that insight, that the insight could help open up space for other advocates to change policy. And same thing on transmilitary. On the Supreme Court, I'm not a court expert, but I just got scared when the court was stolen in 2016, because I know as a political scientist that democracy cannot work when courts are stolen. I actually believe that our democracy is already over, even though Democrats can win elections from time to time. And I think if we win this election and revitalize democracy, we can get it back. But I would argue that it's effectively over now. So part of the reason I chose the court campaign is because I think we're in deep, deep shit as a country, and I think we have basically single party rule now. Even when Democrats win, they can't govern. In other words, that's the problem, because of Republican cheating and obstructionism. But also, I had a strategic insight that I thought could be helpful if we could get people talking about it, because the idea of court expansion had been taboo for 81 years, since 1937, when President Roosevelt tried to expand the court. And the judicial reform organizations on the left, which have done heroic work, and I defer to them, and they have way more expertise, and they're great, and they were not giving the party an option for reversing the theft of the court and restoring democracy in the face of Republican cheating. They were talking about, Democratic candidates have to, nominate, more community organizers and less prosecutors to the bench. Great. Yes, 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 and yes. And that does not solve for the theft of the court. So I guess in all three cases, it was about having a strategic insight that I thought would be helpful if the insight could get amplified in a credible way by validators.
Thanks so much for that. We got more questions to get to here. Ryan, go for it.
Yeah, I have. So I'm not as well versed in the Supreme Court. So I
Wait, Ryan, I'm going to cut you off. Ryan, I have to cut you off. I'm so sorry. I'm only getting 30% of what you're saying, and I can't understand through context. So I would say get a better internet connection, or else type your question, and maybe Breyer can ask it for you.
Yeah, Ryan, please type that in there. I'm happy to read that for you so we can get to that question.
already in chat.
I think we lost you, Ryan. So Ryan, we want to get to your question. Can you just type that in the chat, and then I'll read that out to Aaron?
I think Ryan said that Ryan already typed it out in the chat.
Uh-oh. My chat is not updated with that. I'm going to try and get back to Ryan's question. Why hunt down Ryan's question?
Oh, I have it. I have it.
Oh, great.
Is this from Ryan Alex?
Yes.
Why is it now your goal to increase the size of the Supreme Court? What would increasing the size of the Supreme Court accomplish? Democracies cannot function when courts are stolen. There has to be a penalty for stealing the court, or you can't have democracy. A. B. This court will not allow the next administration or Congress to address the policy emergencies that threaten this planet. And so the Democrats could win the election, come into office, pass good law to improve racial justice, improve abortion access, address climate change, address the 30,000 gun deaths we have a year, fix the broken immigration system, try to do something about healthcare access, economic inequality. They could pass laws on all those fronts. And the Supreme Court might let a few of those stand. Even the most conservative justices occasionally vote in liberal direction. Even the most liberal justice occasionally votes in conservative direction. But on average, this court, even the Kennedy court, which was seen as a moderate court, actually voted in a conservative direction over 80% of the time. And so this court, which is now much more conservative than the Kennedy court was since Kavanaugh and Gorsuch joined, can be expected to prevent the next administration from dealing with the emergencies we face. And there is no time left on the climate change clock, so we can't fuck around. If a climate change law is passed, it's got to endure. So third, it's about rescuing democracy. The court itself has implicated itself in the demise of democracy by destroying the Voting Rights Act, by blessing hyper-partisan gerrymandering, by allowing unlimited dark money to flood our political system. And it's not just Citizens United. It goes back to Buckley Vallejo a generation ago. So they've destroyed our campaign finance system to the point where corporations and rich people can buy policy, which you can also call bribery. And now you're seeing in COVID, they're making incredibly anti-democratic choices that effectively force voters to choose between their health and casting their ballot. They forced Wisconsin primary voters to wait in line when doctors said that wasn't safe. And they did it on the basis of phony, bogus arguments. And so what you have is, I'll give you a data point, but there have been at least up until the last couple months, between 2005 and a couple months ago, there were 80 split decision cases in which Republican donor interests were clear. The Supreme Court voted in the direction favored by GOP donors 80 times, 100% of the time in those hot button cases. So this is a court that prioritizes Republican Party power and Republican donor interests over the well-being of workers and women and people of color and everyday Americans, and is willing to help the Republican Party cheat, for example, by suppressing the vote and preventing millions of black and brown people from voting. And that's not okay. So we got to change that. And court expansion is the only judicial reform that will change that, because other reforms like term limits, they look good on paper, but they will not work in practice, which we can go into, but that's the short bottom line.
All right, and I have one more question from Anya, and then a couple of coach questions that I want to ask in here.
Okay.
Can you go into more detail about the Supreme Court fight that you were talking about earlier? Are you clear on what she's asking, or would you like some clarity from Anya there?
Clarity.
Anya, can you clarify which specific fight you were mentioning?
No, I know what fight she's talking. She's talking about the campaign to expand the Supreme Court, but I don't understand what she's asking about it.
Sure. Anya, can you ask that question again?
Yeah, I was just asking because before you were talking about like how you wanted to, like there was some Supreme Court fight that you were doing, but I didn't realize that that was the one about like expanding the Supreme Court. And but my question was like, could you go into more detail about like the steps you took for
Yeah,
that one?
got it, got it. So the Supreme Court project was hard. It has been hard because when we started, there were no organizations in support of Supreme Court expansion, and there were very few thought leaders, and the thought leaders, it was just like a professor or two. The idea was seen as crazy. And so the question was, how do you get the idea on the map? The reason for getting it on the map is that if you could get the Democratic Party to credibly threaten court expansion, first of all, they might come back into power and actually expand the court, which would be, the golden chalice. But even making the threat to expand the court could have an impact on moderating the Supreme Court, which, is actually exactly what happened as planned. People are arguing that part of the reason for the moderation last term is because Roberts is afraid of court expansion. But also, if you can get a credible threat of court expansion, um, that moves the Overton window. The Overton window is kind of the range of conversation about reform. And predictably, what's happened is by ramping up the conversation about court expansion, there are a whole bunch of Democrats who aren't in favor of court expansion, but they now have to say something about the courts, so they've come out in favor of term limits. That's great because term limits can threaten Roberts as well. So those were the tactical reasons for ramping up the court expansion conversation. And I'm very, very proud that as of today, the conversation's been ramped up. 17 organizations, including powerhouses like Sunrise, the architect of the Green New Deal, and Next Gen America, have called for court expansion. 11 presidential candidates, including moderates like Klobuchar and Harris, said they were open to court expansion, and one, Steyer, even recommended court expansion. Um, Moderate senators like Tim Kaine are now saying that there are conditions under which he would consider court expansion. The Democratic Party last week announced that its party platform, for the first time in history, I believe, is going to call for structural reform of the court. Doesn't specify those reforms, but that is language that never would have been used 2 years ago. So all those are evidence of the progress of the campaign. So how did that happen? The key at first was realizing that during the primaries in general, Republicans who vote in primaries are more extreme and motivated than Republicans who vote in general elections, and Republican and Democrats who vote in Democratic primaries they're the party faithful. They're the more committed progressives than Democrats who vote in general elections. And so the dynamic that you have in primary contests is that a large number of candidates are trying to compete for a pretty small pool of progressives on the Democratic side. And so and one of the ways you compete for progressive votes is you differentiate yourself. You can think of it as product differentiation, or you say something a little bit different from everybody else. And so I knew that there could be an opportunity to get a presidential candidate running for presidential candidate running for president, a Democrat running for president, to talk about court expansion, partly because they believed it and they thought it was right, but also as a way to say, like, I'm a true progressive and you should vote for me during the primary. And so the first kind of amplification of the campaign was we were able to talk with Pete Buttigieg himself and also his staff for about 10 days and really explain why court expansion was so important. And then we planted a question at one of his events, and this was way before he was famous. So when the question was asked, people in the audience laughed. But then he said, this is not a laughing matter, and the court has to be reformed. And he never came out for court expansion exactly. He came out for kind of a moderate form of court expansion. But the media heard him in a way that was slightly different than what he said. And the next day, the media reported, Pete Buttigieg is in favor of court expansion, but he got great headlines. And there were headlines along the lines of, 16 Democrats are running for president, but only one is serious about governance, and it's not Bernie Sanders. And so and so that was a breakout moment for Buttigieg. And And that was a moment when the candidates were like, oh my God, like, this might be an issue we have to endorse. And so then there was a process over the next number of months to get journalists to ask more questions, to ask questions at the debates, to try to get the candidates on record about the courts. Parallel to that, there was a lot of quiet, and there still is a lot of quiet outreach to progressive organizations working on various issues. So we go to the climate groups and we say, you care about climate? If the court's not reformed, you're fucked, even if you get a climate change bill. We go to the racial justice groups and say, look, we could get, great legislation on various racial justice issues, but the court is very likely to dismantle that. Same with the immigration groups, the LGBT groups. Although the LGBT groups are the one set of groups who've actually won in court on a regular basis. And so it's been really hard to get the groups on board for good reasons. I mean, the climate groups are super busy talking about climate. They don't have there are a lot of issues they could be talking about: campaign finance, fair elections. There are a lot of issues that would help them, and it's been slow going. And it's not the case now that every single group has come out in favor of court expansion. So among the gun safety groups, there's only one group that has said that the courts need to be reformed. On climate, three groups have said the courts need to be reformed. On immigration, one group has said the courts need to be reformed. So it's a steep climb, but quiet outreach to the groups has been important. And then finally, using research to generate media headlines, just like the Palm Center. So a new study: Supreme Court would be likely to strike down Green New Deal. So that's been the strategy. It's not they're not special advocacy strategies. I mean, they're the same advocacy strategies that other social justice campaigns use. It's just they're in service of a weird issue. Yeah.
Thanks so much for those answers. You've been a machine in going down these. I want to make sure I honor your time, so let me know when you're getting ready to wrap things up.
I mean, I'm mindful it's 8:40. I'm fine. Your audience might be getting ready for dinner or bed, but I can keep going. So go ahead.
One or two more questions here. And anybody who needs to go, thanks so much for being a part of this. On behalf of the whole MPDL, this has gone great. We appreciate everybody being here, especially Dr. Belkin. I have two questions from a coach out here. First up, and it's kind of a two-parter. One relates a little bit to what you're talking about. You discussed employing social justice strategies. Were you trained in organizing? How did you know which strategies to employ?
No, I mean, I had really wise mentors at the Foreign Policy Institute that I mentioned, where I worked after college. But no, it was mostly figuring things out on the fly. And the person who told me, I remember I used to be on the gay football team in San Francisco, and there was a guy named Mark Bingham who later died on 9/11, storming the cockpit on one of the planes that crashed that day. But he was a media specialist, and he told me that we should try to get media attention to the Palm Center's studies on gays and lesbians in the military. So then it was just a lot of trial and error.
Sounds like a smart and decent guy too. That's awesome. And with the recent protests, some have expressed frustration at how slow progress seems. How do you personally sustain energy for this public education campaign for a decade? And just to echo that, somebody else messaged me when I was commenting on the amazingness of costs and energy. They were saying, it may not cost a ton of money in the relative scale, but it also takes somebody who has a decade to sustain.
Yeah.
So how do you sustain the energy for that?
Yeah, that is a really, really important question. I want to mark a couple points. So I've been very, very, very lucky and privileged in that I've had an academic job all this time, and so if my advocacy fails, I'll still have food on the table. And most social justice advocates don't have that. So that has been one ridiculously lucky and privileged thing. A second thing is that I've been physically safe. I'm a cisgender white male, and I have not had to risk my body for my advocacy, and that is also not the case. As we saw in the George Floyd protests, the BLM protests. It's pretty important these days to risk your body if we expect social justice. So I've been physically safe. I will also say that the work has been the love of my life. So it's very, very meaningful to me. But there are bad days, and there are there are long stretches when stuff doesn't get accomplished, and there are sometimes it's really frustrating when like your allies get mad at you for what seem like dumb reasons, and so there are certainly times when I get mad and sad and frustrated and tired. But I guess like a final thing I'd say is that and I realize there's a lot of privilege just in saying this because I can afford to do this, and it's not the case that every advocate can afford to do this. But I've been able to maintain. I believe in parallel truths, even contradictory truths, and so one partial parallel truth that's been just kind of out there during my advocacy is that at the Palm Center we take care of each other as a family, but we also we try to be a little bit playful about what we're doing. The stakes are life and death for a lot of people in our work. So we're very mindful of how serious the stakes are, but sometimes we like to have fun. And I'll just give an example of, I mean, this is a kind of a geeked out thing to be, to think was funny, but it's still, it makes me smile every time I think of it. But Donald Rumsfeld, who was Bush's Secretary of Defense, just an evil fuck who invaded Iraq, leading to the 500,000 Iraqi deaths and screwed up our foreign policy for a generation, in my humble opinion. So he was once busted in the media for creating a Pentagon bureau that literally was responsible for creating fake media stories in the Middle East to lie to Middle Eastern readers about the wonderfulness of American foreign policy. And his response was, "Oh my God, the Pentagon would never lie," and then he shut the office down the next day. Now we knew that was a lie to say that the Pentagon would never lie because they lied all the time, and in particular on our issue on gays and lesbians in the military. So we did a press release titled "Rumsfeld claim that Pentagon never lies, seen to be untrue." And we had a bunch of experts just kind of, recite all the, or not all the, but many of the different ways that Rumsfeld and the Pentagon lie all the time. And the second that hit the wires, I got a call from Rumsfeld's office, and there's a gay guy a Republican gay guy who was a senior assistant to Rumsfeld, and he just called me screaming about this press release because it embarrassed him as the gay guy in the office that one of his team, like a gay organization, would say something so horrible about Rumsfeld. So I love that one. So part of the answer is to just kind of keep just a tinge of playfulness in mind, even as you're doing super serious stuff, if possible, and if you have the privilege to do that.
That's awesome. And just one more question here from Anna, and then I might have one or two I got saved from some other people. Anna, would you like to ask that question again? Did we lose you there?
No, I'm here. Sorry, I just took me a second to get to the unmute.
You're good.
So last time, just as like a second question, I asked, what goals do you have for the Palm Center moving forward?
Yeah.
And I
forgot.
don't think yeah, okay.
So I'm not sure our donor is going to stick around. So we might, if Biden wins, I think we'll get inclusive policy for transsexuals back quickly. And that might be it for the Palm Center after 21 years. I'm not sure. If we have donor support, there are other fights that we would like to fight. And in order, we need to get the Veterans Administration to offer surgery to the nation's 160,000-ish transgender veterans. I think that's going to be pretty doable and pretty easy because they were already about to do that. And then Trump won the 2016 election and then they canceled the decision. So we're going to have to get that. Then what I want to do is I want to try to get the military to lift its intersex DSD ban. The reason for that is that the ban is just wrong and they don't need it, but also because what I want to do after getting rid of the intersex ban is to get rid of the ban on non-binary trans people. And so what does that mean? So there's not quite a ban on non-binary people, but if you're in the military, you have to declare yourself to be a man or a woman. And for a non-binary person, that's forcing them to make a dishonest choice and then to be managed as a man or a woman, even though that's not fully consistent with their authenticity, and we want that to change. And the generals and admirals are going to go to their graves kicking and screaming that you cannot have mixed identities in the military. That's not my word. That's going to be their word. Mixed identities, and that's going to destroy the military. And I think that's going to be a very, very long conversation. I think we might lose that one. I think it's important to have that conversation. In order to fight that campaign, however, I think we want to get rid of the DSD intersex ban first. Not because there's any relationship between DSD intersex identification and being non-binary, but because in the minds of the generals and admirals, so-called mixed or ambiguous genitals is related to mixed or ambiguous gender identities. And if we can get the question of genitals off the table, because opponents are, their big issue is always about showers and privacy. What are you going to do if you have a person in the men's shower who has a vagina, stuff like that. That's just with transsexuals. But on non-binary, it's going to be like, oh, like, how are you going to have, this person who has an unidentifiable genital, how can they possibly serve? If we can solve that, it's going to make the conversation about non-binary go much smoother. So that's next. And then the final piece, these don't have to be, some of these can be simultaneous campaigns, but the military healthcare system does not offer transition-related surgery to family members and dependents, spouses of service members. That's going to be the hardest thing to change because it is locked in place by statute. Whereas the other bans are regulatory. So if the Democrats get rid of the filibuster, actually it will be possible to move on that more quickly. But if the filibuster remains in place, it's going to be hard to pass a law to change that one. So that's what our work could look like moving forward. But we might have to go out of business if we can't find funding. There is no money in the world on transgender military issues for the most part, aside from this one major donor. So unfortunately, it's a question of funding.
It's amazing the things that can really affect. One donor can make a big difference, and one organization, one message. I have so many other questions I'd love to ask, but just one that particularly I guess I ask as a coach, and people here that are interested in debate and such. You have such a unique background. We coach people all the time and talk to them about the real world versus the debate world and how things play out. If you can reflect, I know it's a while ago, you've had 20 years, it sounds like, plus of working to make a difference. Is there anything you wish you had known when you were a debater talking about these ideas and opinions and thoughts? Is there anything you wish you had known then that now as an adult, you wish you could go back to yourself and say, hey, let's get you a 20-year head start. This is how the world really works, that our debaters might benefit from.
Yeah. By the way, I want to also say there have been some real critiques of our advocacy, and I'm presenting a rah-rah story about our advocacy, but there are serious costs and downsides of it. And if you're interested in that, email me or Google Dean Spade, BuzzFeed, Palm Center, or read the theoretical work by Jasper Puar in Homo Nationalist Assemblages, Terrorist Assemblages, sorry. It's very theoretical, but it's very important critique of this work. So even though I did parliamentary debate in college, I was kind of groomed in high school on Oregon debate, evidence debate. And for better and worse, I became a very linear, or maybe debate reinforced the part of my thinking that was very linear. So I ended up a very linear thinker. Here's point one, evidence point A, evidence point B, evidence point C, harms, topicality, disadvantages, advantages. I guess I don't know if the lingo is the same now, but so a very, kind of point example, point evidence. How do you find the flaw in an argument? How do you, patch a flaw in an argument? It's things like that. I think that way of thinking is somewhat at odds with storytelling and narratives. And there are certainly people who are great narrative thinkers and speakers who are also great at telling stories. I found that whatever indigenous narrative capacity I may have had was, you could say, either not developed or was possibly extinguished by that kind of linear form of thinking. And I think that narrative speaking and thinking can actually be more compelling, weirdly, than evidence, which isn't fair, but is and you see in journalism, like journalists like to tell stories about people, they don't like to tell stories about data. So that's kind of a partial echo of what I'm talking about. Just to partially illustrate what I'm talking about, in college there were this great debater from Harvard named Randy Cohen, who with no preparation went to an evidence tournament, and the evidence debaters in college just had all these briefcases, and with no evidence just went in and either won the tournament or broke to semis or quarters or something like that. The point, and he was a great storyteller. He's also a great linear thinker. But the point is that narrative speaking and thinking and storytelling can be super compelling. And so I would just kind of urge people not to give up on that and to be mindful of that. And I guess a second thing is a more emotional thing, but debate is so cognitive. But I guess I would just say on a personal level, like emotion and your feelings and your energy, for lack of a better word, I think are more important than evidence. And so it's just it's important to be mindful of kind of both realms.
And is there any, for our young people who are launching their debate careers, are there any parting messages or pieces of wisdom? What you said is extremely valuable, I think, and a lot of people could benefit from that. Is there anything else you'd like to let them know as they embark on their debate careers and think about their futures in the real world? Is there anything you'd like to share with them?
I mean, I've personally found that pursuing social justice is more meaningful than pursuing money and materialism. Um, uh, and uh, and I would just encourage people to try to, if they can, put themselves in and even if you're working in a job where you don't have the luxury of pursuing social justice, you can often volunteer on the side. So I would just encourage people, if they have a dream, to try to, at least in some small part of their life, to pursue it and try to advance social justice and see if that feels meaningful to them too.
Thanks so much. Just a final call. I know, Dr. Belkin, you've taken so many questions. I'm getting constant feedback and messages as people do have to move on that they really appreciate this. Are there any final questions or anything you'd like to share with Dr. Belkin before we go?
Yeah, I have some.
Uh-oh, there we go. Xander's got a few and Anna. Go ahead. Go for it.
Okay, so the first one is, did your debate career encourage you to, I think that you've changed the world, or at least, the United States, but I think you've definitely had a big impact. And, do you think debate played a role in that, or was there something else?
I think debate helped me develop confidence as a speaker. And one of my mentors, when I worked at the Foreign Policy Institute, taught me how to be pushy in a diplomatic way, and taught me how to ask for favors. Like leadership, a lot of leadership is asking people for help, and realize that people like to be asked for favors and like to be asked for help, but there's a way to do it that kind of increases your chance of getting what you need, whether it's a donor or a journalist or a member of Congress or someone who might do research for you. You're all day long, you're asking people to help you. And so learning how to do that in a way that is both persistent and pushy, but not off-putting, so that you could say diplomatically learning to ask people for what you need, is very important.
And Xander, I think you had one final question.
Yeah, so my final question was just, hypothetically, if you were to outlaw the filibuster, and if for the SCOTUS plan you would need Biden to become president, hypothetically, do you think that what negotiation would go on in order for this law to pass, and where would it have to pass?
So Congress would have to pass the bill, so Democrats are going to have a majority in the Senate. I think what would trigger the possibility, like a real, I mean, not just like a threat like we have today, but really get this on the agenda in a deeper way. And remember, I mean, Don't Ask, Don't Tell took 17 years to get rid of. The court expansion conversation is 2 years old. Some issues take 100 years to solve or more. So it will not be a surprise if we don't get a court expansion bill, but I think two things that could change the politics are: one is if there's another vacancy this year, either, God forbid, Justice Ginsburg dies or Justice Thomas retires, and if Mitch McConnell fills that seat, the Democrats will be apoplectic because McConnell, when he refused to fill the vacancy to let Obama fill the vacancy after Scalia died, said, made up a phony principle that never existed before, that presidents should not be able to fill vacancies in their last year in office. And so if he goes, and he said, actually, if there's a vacancy, he likes to troll. And so he said, if there's a vacancy this year, of course we'll fill it. So if he does that, yeah, I mean, Senator Tim Kaine said like that would be a condition under which, he'd consider court expansion. So that's one thing. A second thing is that if the Democrats come into office and pass a bill that all sane people acknowledge is necessary for rescuing the country or the planet, maybe it's like a COVID response bill or a climate bill or a gun safety bill or a democracy restoration bill. I'm not, they'll have to debate which bill is the best vehicle. But if he passes that bill with Congress and then some lower court Trump judge issues a preliminary injunction, which would mean that, lower court judges have the option of immediately saying, nope, that law can't be enforced. And so basically a lower court Trump judge could put the White House and Congress in handcuffs from day one. And so but then, the Democrats would appeal the preliminary injunction and the Supreme Court would have to decide, is the law enjoined or not? If the law is suspended or enjoined, that means it's tied up in litigation for years and it basically doesn't take effect. And then the Democrats will lose in the next election and that's it. I mean, you can see with the ACA, the Affordable Care Act, the Republicans are still fighting that in court, 10 years later. Anyways, if the lower court if the lower court suspends a critically needed law and the Supreme Court allows the preliminary injunction or the suspension to stand, that will infuriate the Democrats. And so, because we have laid the groundwork by creating the court expansion conversation. I would argue if we hadn't created the court expansion conversation, there would be no alternative available for them to pick from if and when that happens. So yeah, that's the reason we created the court expansion conversation.
This is really fascinating to talk about, these real world political mechanisms and how it would work. I think we're running the end of our meeting. So first off, I want to thank Dr. Belkin so much for your time, for all the coaches, debaters, friends, and family who joined in for this. I really appreciate you all being here and sticking around for a great 2-hour discussion and hearing all this information. Dr. Belkin, I want to thank you on behalf of the NPDL and everybody here. Akuna McKendra, would you like to chime in with anything here before we let Dr. Belkin head on out?
Hi, Aaron. Thank you so much. I feel like we could have had this discussion for 3 or 4 hours rather than just 2. I have about 5 more questions for you. I just want to say thank you so much for engaging our debaters. When I think about what my goal is as a teacher, it's for our students to be like you in 20 years and to use the skills that seriously, for you. I mean, to use the skills that you've developed to advocate so strategically in the way that you have. I think you're the model that we're really hoping throughout this series to expose our students to. And so I can't express enough gratitude for your time. Thank you so much.
It's very, very kind of you to say. I'm so honored to be here, and I learned a lot from the questions. So thank you so much for engaging. And yeah, I'm glad to continue the conversation anytime.
We really appreciate it. Well, Dr. Belkin, thanks so much.
I actually still have some questions.
But
I mean, I can stay on if you want. I mean, I gotta eat at some point, but I'm fine answering.
I gotta sleep at some point.
Anna's calling in from the East Coast, I believe, as well. So we got people that are all the way from over there joining in.
I can stay online or not. I leave it in the moderator's discretion to what's.
Here's what we'll do. We'll thank everybody for being here so much. If you have to go, you're more than welcome. Not sarcastically, Akuna and I prepared about 12 questions, and this is one of the first times I've been moderating where I barely got in one just because there were so many great ones and overlapping. So you have a whole bunch of debate coach nerds on here. When you talked about nerding out, geeking out, we're loving this. So it's to echo what Acuna said, I think it's really powerful to see somebody that did debate and then didn't just do that and say go to a simple corporate job or sit in a government office, but took that advocacy and made it something actionable using data, using narrative power, using an understanding of how humans actually work in the world and our political process. That's our dream as coaches, for anybody to turn out like that. So an awesome role model for standing up for a group that isn't just you, but our whole country. So yeah, thanks so much. And we'll all stick around for as many questions as we can. For everybody else that does need to sleep or eat or take care of some of those human needs, you're welcome to pop back and come in. But yeah, thanks so much. And we'll just kind of open it up if you guys have questions or comments.
I have to go, but I just want to say thank you. This was really interesting and I really enjoyed it. So thank you.
You're very welcome.
Xander had a question right away, and Anna had a question, I think, afterwards, and everybody else probably has a ton too. Go for it.
Wait, who?
Yeah, so my question was just that in this, so when you talked about how once you finally, after the 17 years, and you got them to take out this cohesion, my bad, that it did not actually apply to transgender because of a different bill, you said. Were you knowledgeable about this, or did they say this after you were fighting?
No. So I'm sorry, I think I wasn't clear. The rationale that the structure of opposition to gay and lesbian troops and trans troops was the same, in that the military was lying about the reason for discrimination, but the nature of the lie was different. So in the case of gay, lesbian discrimination, bisexual discrimination, the lie was that GLB troops undermined unit cohesion. So we wanted to prove that that lie was a lie and change people's minds about it so that judges and politicians could do the right thing policy-wise, knowing that they wouldn't hurt the military. On the case of transgender military policy, the lie was that the military couldn't possibly provide medical care to transgender troops because it's too complicated. So we had to disable a different lie. But I want to make sure I answer the correct question. So if I'm not answering the question, just say so. But if the question is, did I know what I'll ask you, is your question, did I know what the military was saying about trans troops before I started the trans campaign?
Yeah.
Yes, although interestingly, it was harder to figure that out because in the case of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, there had been a very, very public debate where the other side had very, very publicly argued that gays and lesbians undermine cohesion, whereas on trans military service, there really wasn't much of a conversation. And so the rationale for the military's discrimination was articulated in very, very obscure documents that no one knew about and that were hard to get. But we elevated the other side's lie for them. We elevated the other side's lie because we knew that as we create, if we had not, let's just say, sorry, I'm being a little incoherent here. Let's say that we'd started the trans campaign and just said, we're going to fight for trans troops in the military. It's not fair for trans people to be banned from the military. So we make a fairness argument. We knew that because of these obscure documents that the military would say, sorry about the unfairness, but we can't possibly allow trans people to serve because we can't figure out how to provide them medical care. So we anticipated that was going to be the objection that they would use once we started talking. And we were right. Like once we started making the case, I mean, we put them on the defensive because the first, the opening shot in the battle was this report by the Surgeon General that ended up in the New York Times showing that medical rationale was a lie. But they still tried to make their case. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Okay.
Anna, go for it.
Yeah, so I'm really interested in the strategies you've used to further the social justice campaigns, other than the ones you've mentioned, like with getting the research into the media. Are there any new strategies you're using for the court expansion campaign?
So I want to just be really clear. I am not an expert on social justice strategies. There are actually professors who write books about this and teach courses just on social justice campaigns. And there are hundreds and hundreds of strategies, clever strategies that groups around the world have used to pursue social justice. And so if you're interested, Brian can, I can send email Brian and I can send some recommendations for readings. But just in terms of the difference between the Supreme Court campaign and the LGBTQ military campaigns, yeah, the difference is that on LGBTQ, so on gays, lesbians, and bisexuals, we were almost exclusively public education, changing the public's mind. We were in Congress a little bit, but not because we were lobbying Congress. There were other groups that were lobbying Congress on gays and lesbians in the military. So our job was to try to make it easier for those lobbyists by prevailing on the argument in public. But we did have people in Congress a little bit because we relied on members of Congress to do things like get data for us from the Pentagon that we could then turn into studies and media stories. On trans military, there were fewer groups in the space. And so in addition to doing the research, we did a lot, even though it wasn't a congressional policy, we did get Congress involved and we got the White House involved. So we did a lot of work with the White House and Congress. And also we did a lot of work on implementation. On Don't Ask, Don't Tell, basically all you had to do was cancel the ban and that's it. It was not complicated to implement inclusion. On trans military service, there were some complicated implementation problems. You know, what are they going to do about grooming styles, hairstyles? What are they going to do about uniforms? You know, like if someone changes their gender marker on their military ID card. Well, first of all, how are they going to change their gender marker? And when would their uniform change? And how would you decide that and manage that? And fair-minded people had questions about that. So we spent a lot of time researching best practices from other militaries and police departments, and we wrote about 21 policy memos on implementation. And we felt very lucky to have a front row seat in that conversation at the Pentagon, and provided those memos to the people writing the new policies. And most of our recommendations got turned into Pentagon policy. So we were really proud of that. So a strategy on trans that we didn't use on gay, lesbian, bi was implementation advice, not just generating media stories. And then on the Supreme Court, the biggest difference is that, I mean, that's been more like a political campaign than kind of a research public education campaign. We have used research to try to generate media headlines, but the pace is faster because we started the work 2 years ago and we knew that the Democrats had a chance of coming back into power in 2021. So there was very finite time when we had to ramp up this conversation. We also knew that the key to opening the door was during the presidential primaries, and so we thought that we only had until Iowa, the first caucus, when there was going to be a big field, and we thought after Iowa the candidates are going to start dropping out like flies, and so there's going to be less urgency among the candidates to kind of come up with clever outside the box ideas. So the candidates would be most receptive to our ideas before Iowa. So that's a very narrow window of time to create a national discourse over something that's been taboo for a long time. And so in the same way, like when a political campaign speaks, Biden doesn't issue a new research paper every time he wants to make headlines. He just says something. So we had to be more like a political campaign than, we couldn't just like make news every 3 or 4 months. But the problem was that with no credibility, we couldn't just issue a statement and get people to cover it. So that was the difficulty in kind of getting the conversation ramped up on an accelerated schedule when we had no credibility.
It's just to chime, it's really fascinating to me that sometimes I feel like these must have been these grand narratives and these huge battles and these complex from a million angles. And it's not that they're not. There's also these little tiny moments of time or people. We have a 3-month window, and then the primaries will change the dynamics. And I mean, to tie it back to what will relate to some of the people here, so often in debate we make these simplistic claims and oh, this has happened, but sometimes there's these little moments in history. I can't remember who said that quote, but there's there are days and months where a decade happened and decades where nothing happens. And it seems like that's timing. Social movements seems to be such a key. Is it ever frustrating? Do you ever feel like the time has held you back? Like, you know, if you were at a different moment in history, have you ever felt like this is just something we cannot win? We just need time.
I've never had that thought, but I weep over the demise of American democracy and the uh, just deep white supremacy that structures our whole consciousness and culture. I actually I applied for Canadian permanent residency after the 2016 election, and I didn't think I would use it, but I just skedaddled up to Vancouver a month ago because I really and I might come back, but I'm very worried and pessimistic about the United States, and so I'm just like super concerned.
Xander and Anna, I think you got a couple more questions.
Sorry, but you know, I would argue the United States has always been a country that does terrible damage to people at home and abroad, and you know, the genocide of Native Americans, slavery, and the gratuitous killing of hundreds of thousands of civilians around the world. So American power to me was, you know, not a good thing even before the recent declines, but now it's worse.
I mean, it's one of those double-edged swords. It's hard to find. You believe in something, you believe in your country, you have hopes and dreams, but it's hard to acknowledge. I think a lot of people are going through that right now, this reckoning of our real identity, whether it be around police reform, racial justice. It's hard.
Well, even liberal leaders like Obama, you know, feed us a diet of American exceptionalist bullshit about our greatness, and it's just very hard to develop a critical eye like when you're immersed in that bullshit.
Xander and Anna. Xander first.
Yeah, so my question was that I know that this like kind of is a basic question, but just like at what point do you feel sorry, I'm gonna actually gonna ask a different question because I don't like that one. But this one is what is your vision of the United States in 20 years if you had to say? Like what was your ideal United States?
We'd have truth and reconciliation about the extent to which our wealth is based on white supremacy at home and imperialism abroad. We would enact policies that would mitigate economic inequality and that would provide public transportation so we wouldn't have to be reliant on cars. We would take radical steps to fight climate change at home and inspire the world to get to zero emissions immediately. We would provide universal access. We would institutionalize as much as possible anti-racist policies that, you know, for starters, would ban all forms of guns, not just pistols, and would address hyper-incarceration, especially of nonviolent criminals. We would provide a quick path to citizenship for undocumented immigrants. We would ban voter suppression in every form. We would have public financing of elections to make it harder for corporations to buy policies. Yeah.
Small checklist.
Well, I mean, even in, you know, social democracies that achieve a lot of that, like Canada and parts of Europe, I mean, a lot of that wealth is stolen from, you know, First Nation peoples or, you know, from imperial conquests. But there are countries that come closer to getting it right than we do.
Alex, you got a question there, and then on the last question. Alex Waits, did you have a question?
Yeah. My question is, I guess, a follow-up on Xander's, and are you optimistic about whether the United States can actually get to a place where those changes occur? Because I feel sometimes I think I feel very pessimistic because oftentimes, because power has become so concentrated and top heavy in America, it just seems like you'd really need something fundamentally radical to take it out or change.
I'm wrong a lot every day, and I'm not just saying that, it's true, and I hope I'm wrong, and I very well could be wrong, but I think we're going down as a society. I think we have to fight as we're going down. I don't think we should, just sit there and passively allow the country to continue to deteriorate. But I mean, you know, 42% of the country thinks Trump is okay. That might not be enough to win the 2020 election, but that means that 42% of the country is okay with terrible, terrible shit. I mean, just terribleness. And it is hard to have a functioning democracy. And it's not like that 42%, they didn't come out of nowhere, but they've been, kind of induced into their positions by capitalists who use Fox News to shape their views. And so, um, uh, no, we're in trouble, I think.
Always hard when somebody gives an honest answer like that, but I think it's tough. I think you see that a lot right now. There's a lot of, even before COVID, there's a lot of pessimism. There's a lot of challenges that we're facing. We're facing a lot of reckonings on these issues. One of those issues Anna just asked in there, and she can ask out loud if she'd like, or I can say it in there. I think she had a question about healthcare specifically.
Well, it wasn't a question that I really wrote, like that I prepared or whatever, but it was just a follow-up basically on on Xander's thing, because you said you had a vision for America, but I noticed you didn't include anything about healthcare, and I was recently heard a presentation about it, and it made me realize how bad it really is in the United States. So I was just wondering if you had any visions about healthcare
Yes,
for the future.
yeah, absolutely. Medicare for all, universal access, free and available health care for anyone who lives in the United States. Absolutely.
Aaron, not to plant ideas before we end here, but next.
That would save $1 trillion a year and give us better healthcare outcomes. So our healthcare system is more expensive than the rest of the world's, about 50% more expensive than comparable countries, and our healthcare outcomes are worse. So we have a ridiculous healthcare system that helps nobody except doctors and pharma.
You heard it here first. Your next book's going to be called Aaron Belkin, A Vision for 20 Years from Now from the United States. All right. Last few questions. I'm sure it's getting a little late here, and I'm sure it is exhausting too to deal with all these, right? These are some heavy issues, and I just want to say you have my admiration. I find it hard to coach all this and deal with this and just talk about it and help youth with it. You were living these struggles, so there must be a huge surge of just joy when you can achieve these, and it must be so exhausting to be a part of these struggles. The endurance is impressive.
You have to derive meaning just from walking the path, aside from the outcome, just the process. Yeah.
As McKendra said, I think you need to run for office. You got McKendra's vote already. McCoy's on board.
Thank you.
Xander and Anna.
What? No, I get to go before him because.
All right, Anna, your turn now.
Okay, so are there any other areas of LGBTQ rights that you're interested in advocating for, as in outside of in the military? Because you did mention like non-binary people in the military, but outside of the military, do you have any things there?
There's a lot of work to be done, and I'm inspired by activists and scholars like Dean Spade, who work on prison reform, conditions for sex workers, healthcare access, economic inequality. So yeah, there is a ton of work that needs to be done. I mean, at the federal level, the question of kind of religious exemptions to compliance with federal law, or RFRA, is going to be a growing area of concern, unless we take the court back. But I think in terms of my personal engagement, I think like the military lane is where I will stay if I can.
Sorry, Xander, did you have one more final question there?
Yeah. So this one has to do more with debate. What's the main difference that you feel from when you do debate, right, you're talking about real issues, right? Or generally. But in the real world, what do you find the differences? Like, what's the huge difference from these issues in debate and the issues in the real world?
Wait, are you asking a stylistic question, like what's the difference in speaking style, or are you asking about like content and substance?
Sorry, I think I'm more so asking like how do these issues compare, and like how can you have an impact in the real world in like debate compared to?
Sorry, I might be misunderstanding. Are you asking if persuasion works differently in debate as opposed to real world activism?
Yeah, and also just like how do you view issues differently?
I see, I see. So, yeah, no, your question was very clear, and my understanding was circumscribed. I'm sorry. That is a great question. Well, I'll say that. I don't know if I have an answer to that, but I'll say this. In debate, of course, it's one of the skills you're developing is trying to see any issue from multiple angles and to see strengths and weaknesses in the arguments on all sides. Um, in advocacy, that is important to do. But I was thinking in preparation for this conversation, like, what if someone asked, and I didn't know if you guys would want to talk about, sorry, guys is not the right word. I didn't know if you students would want to talk about strategy and or just kind of the arguments, the pros and cons of the issues themselves. And I thought, look, what if someone asks me about like the arguments opposed to gays? Are there any good arguments that you can marshal in opposition to open gay and lesbian service in the military? And I can't think of any because I'm so convinced that the other side just lies whenever they speak. So I guess one difference is, at least in my mind, I kind of maybe lost that ability to see wisdom on both sides of an issue, and I'm not sure if that's a strength or a weakness. So I think that's the only answer I could give.
I think that's one of the constant challenges of debate is finding where you truly stand when it feels like you can be forced to argue for anything at any time. Um, I think that's where it's beautiful to see that transition of people that take these skills and then go into the real world and do something really good, really powerful, where they look at, say, how can I take my understandings I've developed, my awarenesses, my communication ability, my collaborative ability, my listening ability, and then take it out into the real world and not just do a policy that might help me win in my career, but help everybody. I mean, throw around jargon, help there be net benefits actually made to the world, right? So yeah. I think it's getting late. We got our last few people here, so I want to thank you so much. And I think Aaron, Dr. Belkin, whichever you prefer, would you prefer here? I think we would love to have you back at some point. So maybe we'll have to schedule a part 2 because I'm getting a slew of text messages and emails going, oh my God, I have so many questions about Supreme Court now. What are we going to do about this? So it really was appreciated you sharing all your insights.
I still have.
And some of our people even have more still.
We're an honor.
Go ahead, Aaron, you were saying.
Well, why don't we take one final one, but then if anyone has more, they can email me. How about that?
It's a great idea.
Yeah, okay. So you listed the 3 social justice campaigns you were a part of, and the first 2 were about gay, lesbian, and bisexual, and then the second one was trans troops. But what about non-binary folks, which you answered? And just as a question of nuance, what about pansexual people? And like, are there certain still minorities that don't have rights in the military, like as specifically as like sexuality minorities?
That is a really, really interesting question. Yeah, so on non-binary service members, we say that we, the community says that, say we've been working on transgender troops in the military, but we've really been working on transsexuals in the military. So people who are binary, either self-defined as men or women. And my strategic calculation was that we should not talk about non-binary troops unless and until we got good policy for transsexuals locked in place, because that would make it harder to. So it's kind of like a one at a time, one slice at a time approach. Which you can certainly disagree with. I mean, you can, and people made the case during the Don't Ask, Don't Tell conversation. They say, why aren't you talking about trans? Like, you're only talking about gay, lesbian, bisexual. So yes, I did make a tactical decision, and other groups have made mostly the same tactical decision to first deal with gay, lesbian, and bi discrimination, then transsexual, and then non-binary would come next. Pansexual, that's fascinating. I mean, that's a whole. I mean, yeah, there are a lot of identifications that the country needs to have a conversation about, including polyamory, and how rights would map. What do you do in a system where healthcare depends on your spousal status, and someone steps forward and says they have 8 spouses, and I don't have answers for those questions. I have not thought deeply about that. There are some professors and law professors who are starting, or who have been starting to think about those issues for the last few years, but I'm not one of them, so I don't have a good answer.
Well, actually, the reason I said pansexual, what brought it to my attention was during this meeting itself, I had one of my friends message me that at that moment they were in a server that they were getting called the F slur, and like a question off of that is like, are there any changes that you could see happening to make like youth more comfortable with like their identity and like mental health surrounding that, especially not being afraid to like accept who they are?
Of all the questions that have been asked tonight, I hate like ranking and hierarchy and stuff like that. But like, to me, that's really up there as one of the best questions of the night, and I just don't have a good answer, because I'm shamefully undereducated and not well read on questions of sex education and questions of sexual health. I mean, in general, my philosophy, and there are programs that talk a lot about sex education and sexual health, and really kind of trying to develop national comfort and literacy and fluency about the kind of huge multiplicity of sexual and gender identifications. For example, at University of Minnesota, the program in human sexuality. So there are people who work on this, and have policy solutions that would answer you, but I'm not one of those people. So why don't you start by Googling the program in human sexuality at University of Minnesota, and looking at their publications, and maybe go from there.
Sorry, do you know the name of it, or?
It's called PHS, Program in Human Sexuality, University of
VHS
Minnesota.
or DHS? Sorry.
P is in Peter, so
Okay.
Program in Human Sexuality. The director is Eli Coleman, Coleman.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, you can tell this has been something awesome for everybody involved. So thanks everybody for sticking around for so long. And Dr. Belkin, I really hope we get to maybe talk to you again sometime in the future. I really appreciate you coming back here, 20 years later, and giving back to the debate community. We all really benefit from it.
Honor to talk with you. We'll continue the conversation at your convenience.
Thanks so much. Take care. Have a great night, everybody.
Good night.
Thank you.